may be seated. No calisthenics this morning, saints and sinners, all right? We're going to be all right with no heads and toes and knees and shoulders and all that fun stuff, all right? I often wonder what Lazarus had to say about this experience for him. We don't hear a word from him through this whole story, his death and resurrection story. We just know that he was dead. Don't know what disease or illness caused him to be there, but it didn't take away the fact that he was dead. Lazarus was one of the good friends of Jesus, along with his sisters, Mary and Martha. Jesus liked to stay at their home in Bethany as he was traveling throughout that region. So Lazarus had a special place in Jesus' heart. And we know that his death grieved Jesus greatly, troubled him. There's some verses we left out of there for the sake of time. I encourage you to read the 11th chapter of John later on. We get a chance there. But Lazarus' death grieved Jesus. He wept. He cried over this. But Jesus, far greater than death, did something really special in Lazarus' life and raised him back to life again. And I wonder, how did Lazarus see it? What was his experience of it? From being dead to now being alive. I know that that moment in his life gave him a new story, a story of hope and faith, a story of death and life. He had a witness to share at that moment. His very presence on earth was pretty special, but imagine him being able to share that story with many others. He had a story of hope and faith that set him on a new life. Fast forward several hundred years later, and we find another man who has not a death story, but a spiritual death story. That of Martin Luther. He was locked into this theological system in the medieval ages, and he believed that he was not going to be able to be saved, that he was doomed and destined for eternal suffering and eternal death, and he felt like Lazarus. But he rediscovered the gospel. In Habakkuk 2:14, the righteous shall live by faith. Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of the power of God, for it is the righteous that will live by faith. By grace you have been saved through your faith. He discovered these wonderful verses hidden in the scriptures that took him from his death moment and set him into new life. And he had the story, a new story of hope and faith. We're coming into the 500th anniversary year of remembering that moment when Martin Luther rediscovered the gospel and launched this movement for the church also to rediscover it and reclaim our own stories of hope and faith. And as a church staff, we've been wondering what are the kinds of things we ought to do to commemorate this Reformation moment and look at 500 years of history. And we thought we can do a really big worship service, and we'll probably do that in October. We thought maybe we can look back at all the history of the Reformation and kind of what led up to it, those main principles. We've done a little bit of that. But we've asked ourselves the question, is it just about looking behind us, or is it about looking forward? And if we look forward, what do we look forward to? I think we look forward to a story of hope and faith, our own stories of hope and faith. Just as Lazarus had his story of hope and faith, Martin Luther had his story of hope and faith, you all have stories of hope and faith that ought to be told, that should be told, that need to be told. And so between now and October, you're going to hear from a variety of people just over, not every day or every week or every Sunday that we'll get together, but a variety of people between now and October who are going to come forward from the pews and share with you their story of hope and faith, of their struggle, and of how God spoke out to them to come and live into this new life. It starts today. I want to invite Caroline Meeker to come forward. She's one of our fantastic seniors in our high school ministry. She's got a powerful story that she's going to share with us. But as we listen to this, listen for Jesus' words of Lazarus, come out. Let's welcome Caroline.
Good morning.
Morning.
Before I begin, I would like to thank Pastor Paul for inviting me to speak with you all today. My story isn't something that is easy to talk about, but I'm grateful for this opportunity to share it with you and my church family. When I was 8 years old, I guess you could say I started out as a pretty normal third grader. I loved school, my teachers, my friends, and sports. Even though I seemed like a happy-go-lucky kid, I never really felt that way on the inside. I put on this mask made up of happiness and a feeling of being carefree, when the feeling on the inside wasn't the same. Inside, I was anxious, I was a worrier, a perfectionist, a strict rule follower, and very much a people pleaser. I was always overly concerned about what others thought of me. I don't know why, but I try to keep these characteristics hidden. These traits pretty much lay dormant in my brain until one day a girl called me fat. Until that moment, I never once thought of myself as fat. In the reality of it all, I was hardly 65 pounds soaking wet. And in that single second, that one word changed my whole perception of myself and my whole life altogether. A tiny word that could mean absolutely nothing to one person meant the entire world to me. That word flipped a switch in my brain that will never turn off. That single word pulled the trigger on a gun that was fully loaded with my genetic makeup. That word triggered my eating disorder. Before that day, I never had a problem with the way I looked. Before that day, I never had a problem with what I saw in the mirror. I never body shamed myself before then. Self-worth grew to be my biggest challenge. I couldn't accept my body for the way it was, and I couldn't love myself for who I was. These concepts became harder to overcome as the eating disorder voice grew stronger. It's common for eating disorders to happen very quickly. They have a tendency to spiral out of control until the need to be thin, to be perfect, to look exactly how the models in magazines look, becomes an obsession. I would often find myself climbing to the top of my mom's closet, reaching for her scale to weigh myself several times a day. I began reading food labels, checking the grams of fat and calories, not even knowing what was considered too much or too little. I would constantly pinch my stomach to check for fat, so often that my skin became raw and red. I was harsh and cruel to my body. I continued to play sports but refused to hydrate, believing that anything that went into my mouth made me fat. I began restricting food intake and stopped swallowing my saliva because I was convinced that it too made me fat. By May of third grade, I'd been taken to see my pediatrician and a couple of psychologists, and even had a brief stay in the hospital because one of my lungs had collapsed after a track meet. During my hospitalization, I remembered my parents discussing placing me in an eating disorders facility. But the day I was discharged, I started eating again and returned back to a brief state of normalcy. My parents were hopeful that I'd turn the corner and this was all a phase that would soon be forgotten. Unfortunately, it only took a week for my eating disorder to come back, and it returned stronger than ever. I began restricting food again and developed classic eating disorder behaviors. Behaviors such as making excuses for not eating. I recall telling my mom I couldn't eat the chicken one night because it was too sweaty. Negotiating with my parents, asking things like, well, if I eat this, can it count as my lunch and dinner? Eating only certain safe foods, usually those containing very low fats and calories. Being involved in preparing meals but not eating them. Obsessively checking myself in the mirror, pinching my stomach, and wearing layers of clothing to hide my body. I would even get off the bus at the wrong stop to run the rest of the way home. My anxiety was becoming uncontrollable. I stopped playing with friends and mostly kept to myself. There wasn't a time when I wasn't sucking in my stomach because the need to be thin all the time was never ending. I couldn't communicate very well because of my mouth being so full of saliva due to my refusal to swallow it. It was a constant, deathly fear of becoming fat. That fear I lived with every moment of every day. And when I had to overcome that simple fearfulness, the feeling of regret came right after. With every meal, there was regret. Even eating something as little as a couple of slices of fruit would give me that feeling, resenting even that thought of eating it. I started taking in fewer and fewer calories. I had lost so much weight by the middle of May that I developed a layer of fine baby hair all over my body to keep me warm, and my skin was turning yellow. My body was shutting down and had gone into survival mode. I remember one day the school nurse calling me out of class because she wanted to check on me. There were concerns raised by my teacher, so she pulled me in and examined and weighed me blind so that I couldn't look at the numbers on the scale. She had sent me back to class and immediately called my mom crying. I had weighed 46 pounds. I spent that summer in the first part of 4th grade in the Center for Pediatric Eating Disorders at Children's Medical Center of Dallas. Even though Children's is all about family-centered care, this concept did not apply to the psych unit. I was stripped from my parents and was unsure of when I would see them again. I was alone, and it was nothing short of a nightmare. I was only 9. I was the youngest patient on the unit, placed among teenagers talking about things that were way over a 9-year-old's head, things that a 9-year-old shouldn't be hearing about. Initially, I had an IV and series of tests to check to see if there was any damage to my organs. Thankfully, the physical damage was minimal, and my body could recover if I followed the meal plans carefully designed to slowly return me back to a healthy weight. I was given specific amount of time to finish the mandatory meals and snacks provided. When a timer went off during these meal times, I had to drink a calorie supplement equal to the calories I didn't eat. This program and all of its rules that came along with it were extremely overwhelming in the midst of my shaky mental state. During the beginning weeks of my fight, I was certainly at my lowest. I had been confined to a wheelchair because I was at risk of burning any calories just by being on my feet. I was treated less as a medical patient and more like a criminal, unable to privately mourn the loss of my innocence in childhood. I remember waiting for visitation hours that only came around once a day from 7 to 9 p.m., waiting so eagerly to finally see my parents and brother again. These couple of hours were usually filled with me crying hysterically, begging them to take me home. Those hours were short, and after that it was shower in bed as the staff monitored me through every step of that routine, making sure I wouldn't exercise or make myself sick. I was a difficult case for everyone, especially the night staff, who had to come in every few minutes to stop me from exercising so I could burn off the few calories that I had taken in that day. I've never received such little privacy. My days on the unit were filled with visits from the doctors and tons of therapy: individual therapy, pet therapy, group therapy, family therapy, and art therapy. I'd make some progress, but overall it was more of a 1 step forward and 2 steps back kind of thing. By July, I wasn't getting any better. My doctor told my parents I was struggling too hard, and it was time to have the discussion he was hoping to never have. He had made the difficult decision to relieve the stress of food and replace my fears with supplement through the help of a feeding tube. I had to make my meal plan, which meant eating every meal and snack without getting fed through the tube for 5 straight days. I succeeded, and the tube came out. I was able to transition from being inpatient to outpatient. This meant I was at the hospital every day from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. I was able to go home in the evenings to sleep if I met my behavior plan requirements. I was even allowed to go home for an entire day in the weekend. Unfortunately, I was still struggling to get better. The feeding tube had been my incentive to eat, but now that it was out, there was no longer any motivation to get better. I went through the motions in therapy, telling everyone what they wanted to hear, and began supplementing liquid for all of my meals. Years later, my parents told me it was at this point that they felt me slipping away. I was disappearing both literally and figuratively. As creepy as it sounds, my eating disorder had almost completely taken over my personality. I was more like my eating disorder, or Ed, as they would say, than my actual self. I was having all sorts of illogical thoughts, and my fear of being fat was becoming more intense. I thought everything would make me fat. My medicine, blow-drying my hair, lotion, saliva, and even blankets. This may sound odd, but I had the feeling that if anything was put into me or on me, would cause me to gain weight. I would have bouts of screaming, yelling, crying, all about how fat I was going to get and how my parents were forcing me to eat, that I absolutely hated eating. I screamed that I had urges to exercise and couldn't stop the Ed voice in my head. I called my parents liars because they allowed me to gain weight after they promised they wouldn't. I screamed that I hated them, over and over and over again. I screamed that I wanted to die, to please just let me die. It would be so much easier. In August, my doctor had said I was his most difficult case and began to wonder if a different approach was needed. There was talk of sending me to a residential facility in Arizona, but thank God it never came to that. Instead, my medical team decided to shake things up. Apparently, I was becoming too comfortable on the unit. I thought I was in charge and running the show. I was testing my team, picking and choosing what meals I'd eat and what I'd restrict. Plus, I just had a few sassy days and wasn't minding very well. So my doctor changed my behavior plan. The incentives for making my meal plans became all or nothing. I had to eat without supplementing and receive privileges only when I ate all meals and snacks each day. My time at home was taken away, and I was told I wouldn't be starting school later that month. This news, as you can imagine, was heartbreaking. I would no longer be a normal kid getting to start a new year of school like the rest of my friends. The feeling of being normal was slipping further and further away. The new restrictions that were placed upon me, in a way, brought me back to reality. I started noticing things other than my eating disorder again. I began noticing the look on my parents' faces every visit. My mom's tears and my dad's calm but anxious presence. I wish I could pinpoint the exact moment and the thoughts that were running through my head that made me decide to turn things around. But then again, I was 9. I was just 9 years old. At 9, you're supposed to be playing with your friends and not worrying about everything that goes into your mouth. At 9, food should not be scary. So I can't tell you exactly why, or how, or when I started to get better. But I can tell you who. God was there. He was there through my doctors. He was there through my mom and my dad. He was there through family and friends. He was there. God's presence through others gave my parents the hope and strength to continue to fight for me through the ups and downs of my disease. Throughout my illness, my mom kept family and close friends updated through a website called Caring Bridge. This website was helpful when updating people about my well-being through journal entries. Instead of having to update everyone individually, it was a great place to go where everyone could get the latest news and what was happening in my day-to-day health. About 6 months ago, my mom asked me if I'd like to read her journal entries. One of the things that stood out to me, even in the bleakest of times, was the fact that my parents never lost hope. And after reading what some of our friends and family had written, I had no idea how many people were praying for me. And I was so touched by the outpouring of love and support. Again, God was there. When I started my recovery, I had lost so much of who I was that in order to find myself again, I had to start with what I knew. I knew I loved telling jokes with my brother. I knew that I loved watching reruns of I Love Lucy with my mom on the nights I couldn't fall asleep. And I loved shopping around in my dad's closet more than I did mine. In the beginning, that was what I knew. But the more I recovered, the more I remembered. I remember saying prayers with my family before they left after visiting hours. And when I was alone, trying to fall asleep, this verse from years of Sunday school went through my head from Joshua 1:9. Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. I found that this verse kept me calm. A sense of tranquility would wash over me. And somewhere along the way, I learned that God doesn't give you hardships. God doesn't dump traumatizing experiences on you. He doesn't decide the time or place, when or where something unfortunate will happen to you. But he does promise that he'll be there. Over the next few years, I continue to see my psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a nutritionist on a regular basis. My recovery continued for several years. Eating disorders are a disease. They're not a choice. They're not a phase or fad. They should not be treated as something to hide or be embarrassed of. They should be treated the same as any other illness. It's a disease that manifests in the mind and under fear of weight gain. Eating disorders can affect anyone, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, size, or status. They do not discriminate. I have to remind myself that there's no magic cure. There's no making it all go away forever. There are only small steps forward, an easier day, an unexpected stillness, and a mirror that no longer matters. My illness will always be a part of me, and I refuse to ever let it be ashamed of. The silence of this disease must be broken. There are still hard days, days where I reprimand myself of the shoulds and shouldn'ts of eating, but I have learned so much from it. This fight is real, unexpected, and tests you with things you would never imagine having to face. We should be kind to ourselves, believing our reflections aren't the only thing that tells our stories. My hope is that we all see ourselves the way God sees us. Thank you.
It's big stuff. This is our hope, is to be able for y'all to share what happens in life. And I've long come to accept, along with Caroline, that God doesn't dump traumatizing experiences on people, but life does. And when life does, God gives us Jesus. And Jesus speaks out to us. And he says, come out from your tomb, come and live. We live in God's grace. And when you encounter the gospel, you get a new story, one filled with hope and one filled with faith. And I'm thankful for Caroline for being the first one out of the gate of sharing this story. We've got other people we're going to line up to over the course of the next several weeks as we make our way to October to celebrate the Reformation. But again, the opportunity to come out to share that story, that great, great story of hope and faith. If you've got one to share, you think God is leading you to share it, don't speak to me. We'll find you some space. Amen.